Hi, Judd here, and 50 years ago today, at about 2 p.m., I pulled into the State House in Boston and completed my 5,400-mile journey to the Grand Canyon and back, the Judd Hines Ride for Research for the American Cancer Society, a senior project at Mount Hermon School for Boys. When last we spoke, I was packing up my gear and getting ready to leave the Grand Canyon. I didn't pack up everything. I sent about half of my stuff home by mail, mostly camping gear that I simply didn't need on the road. But I left the Grand Canyon apparently from these notes on April 23rd and have no idea where I spent the 24th, 5th, and 6th, other than on the 27th I had made it to Lamar, Colorado, and on the 28th to Kansas City. It's pretty good. The trip home was interesting in that it seemed people in the Cancer Society, in the PR departments, the various people associated with this were starting to catch on. And so there were many more things planned for me on the way home as far as press and meeting people and things like that went. Also, it was different for me because I'd made it to the Grand Canyon and, so it was done. I'm coming home. The return trip is always different than the journey out. Of course, in hindsight, I really blew it on this thing. I had just picked that I would do 100 miles a day and planned the trip on that basis because I had heard of a thing called the Century Day in the bicycling magazines, and that seemed to be a reasonable thing. That was a 100-mile day. Of course, that wasn't taking into account carrying gear and being dressed for weather and riding in the winter and up mountains and stuff. And it's only with hindsight, and very, very late hindsight, as in about 2 or 3 weeks ago, that I realized, my God, I really blew it. I should have planned for 50 miles a day, and I would have had a much more enjoyable trip and just gone one way. The time I had for this trip was very defined. I had to leave on March 13th because that was the end of the trimester at Mount Hermon. So that was the first I could leave. That was the start of vacation, actually. And I had to be back in Boston by the 22nd for my cousin's wedding. So those dates were very well defined, and I based it all on that, and I worked it out. I actually got home on the 19th, and that gave me those 100-mile days, plus or minus. Some days were 77 miles. Another day was 116 miles. It varied. It's funny when you're just looking at a map and you say 100 miles and you trace out on the map and, well, the next city is just over there a little bit, and you go to that and it's just another 16 miles, and that doesn't seem like much until you're out on the road at the end of a 10-hour day and you've still got 16 miles to go. Another thing on the trip home, I had dropped my camera on my second to last day at the Grand Canyon as I was heading down to get a helicopter ride into the Grand Canyon. What a time to lose your camera. So I came home without a camera, which had its pluses and minuses. I didn't have any urge to stop and take pictures, which was a big problem on the way out because stopping was a big deal. It killed my time, but you wanted that picture if you had the ability to get it. Not having the ability to do that at all on the way home left me no decision to make. I just kept riding. So what I have on the return trip are press clippings and pictures others took, and basically they don't really start until DC. DC was the big thing. I had to be in DC on the 12th of May, because on the 13th was the Cancer Society's banquet there where I was going to speak, and they had set up meetings with various people. So that's where the pictures start, the press clippings. The biggest name I met was Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, which was very interesting. This was interesting seeing the different manifestations of the three representatives I met in D.C. Senator Kennedy was very busy. I mean, this was a hit-and-run visit, literally 5 minutes in the hallway outside his office while he was racing from one appointment to another, and very businesslike. I mean, it was friendly enough, but it was businesslike. It was like, we're doing this photo shoot, boom, 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 done, that's it, okay, I'm off. And he had a room full of secretaries, at least a dozen, working on material for him. This is at a time when he was still considered a prime presidential candidate, and I was tempted to ask him if he was going to run, figured maybe I could get the scoop. And he wrote me out a check, and somebody commented that it was a little check, but I pointed out that the guy already gives plenty of money to the Cancer Society, and this was just just a little bonus to recognize my bike ride. I also asked him for his autograph, and as I did so, I was gesticulating with my hands, and I had my hat in my hands. So he said fine and grabbed my hat and signed my hat, thinking that's what I wanted. So that is how the signing of my hat began, and here you see his signature on my hat. That's Ted Kennedy's real signature. Now, next I met with Silvio Conti, who was the representative for Franklin County in Massachusetts, and this guy was fun. His office, he had one secretary in an adjoining office, and we chatted and socialized like two old buddies getting together. We went outside and posed for photographs. He was just a fun guy. He was going through his cabinet seeing if he could find me some little souvenirs with my visit to D.C., and I had him sign my hat. And then he took me to lunch in the House of Representatives restaurant at the United States Capitol, and that was quite an impressive, thrilling thing. It's a very fancy restaurant, incredible service. It's like probably a 5-star restaurant, and as you can see, the prices are pretty reasonable. I forget what I had, but whatever it was really good. And I was just more or less overwhelmed by the whole thing. Here I am eating with all these high mucky mucks, who are running the country. But he made me feel right at home. I mean, he wasn't high and mighty at all. He was just a good buddy. I also met with Margaret Heckler, but apparently she didn't have the PR people on hand or something, so there's no pictures or no mentions of her anywhere. But it was a pleasant visit. And I was supposed to get a tour of the White House, but somehow that fell through. They couldn't get the timing worked out. The American Cancer Society in D.C. had set this all up. So after I finished D.C., then the next stop was Elkton, Maryland, where I stayed with Mrs. Mary, pictured here. And oh, was she so nice. Made me a cup of tea. I remember she made me a cup of tea, and that was like the best cup of tea I ever had. She lived in a fabulous old house, a historical house, just absolutely beautiful, with all the touches, the fine china and all this stuff. And I spent the night there, and that was just, I really have great memories of her. I enjoyed her very much. And then off to the next stop was Philadelphia. Now, in looking at this, it's amazing what I got done in Philadelphia, considering I was there for one day. But I was hooked up by the local American Cancer Society with a photographer and a young lady who was my guide and hostess. And we did a little tour of Philadelphia. And all these pictures were taken by the photographer who was telling me how to pose. Now, I don't know what ship this was. It was some ship that's docked there as a tourist attraction. Could be the battleship New Jersey, but he had me pose in different places around the ship, and he thought it was a great kick to get me in the ship's barber chair. Later, we were over at the TV station for an interview, and Channel 3, so whatever Channel 3 is in Philadelphia, I was there. There I am. Also, the cameraman got in his car and trailed me riding my bike through Philadelphia, and that video footage was on TV. I got to see it on TV, but of course I don't have a copy of it. We didn't do things like that then. Photographs were hardly done back then, but we toured all the sites. I saw the Liberty Bell. That's the real thing right there. And Independence Hall. I think this is the room where the Declaration of Independence was signed. I think that's Ben Franklin outside of Independence Hall. And then we went to this restaurant that had been alerted to our coming or something. I'm not sure how this was set up, but they put a big sign in the window for the American Cancer Society. And remember, this is all about raising money and awareness of the American Cancer Society. And I stuffed myself there. That was a good meal. You see, I still got my backpack there, and they got my name in the window. And then there's my hostess. There's another picture where she actually kissed me, but she made the photographer cut that out of the roll of film. He didn't send me prints. He sent me a print of the negatives. And then in Philadelphia, this bike ride took place where hundreds ride bikes 20 miles to aid fight against cancer. And according to an ACS official in Philadelphia, the organizer of this ride credited my ride as his inspiration. And earlier, when I came across Ohio, I had actually intersected a massive ride there, like 100 miles or something, of thousands of bicyclists doing the same thing. And I was told that the person who organized that made the same claim that my ride had been his inspiration. So this sort of got that whole riding for raising money thing going. Maybe. And then out onto Long Island. I wanted to see some people there who were related to a teacher of mine, Cousin Elsie, Judson Stent's cousin. And she was in a nursing home out there, and I just wanted to stop by and say hi to her on behalf of Stent. And so I went out on Long Island, which is a long island. And I was sent this, I don't remember half of this, but anyway, out at the end of Long Island on Orient Point, I took the ferry over to New London, Connecticut. Now somebody in the ACS had gotten a copy of my notebook with my itinerary early in it. And you notice here they've written in Boston at approximately 2 p.m. on May 19th. So it was like I was on a schedule here, which added to the difficulties of my timing on this ride. Also, I'll note on that earlier itinerary we were looking at, very few of those places I actually ended up at. On my personal copy of that, I've got different locations written in after most of the first ones. I spent my last night on the road in Pawtucket with some wonderful people there, a real fun family. And then at about 6 o'clock, they said, we're going out to dinner. And as we're going out the door, they informed me that where we're going is to the local Cancer Society's annual banquet, as it were, a very small affair. And I was the guest speaker. I had no idea that this was happening. We're 15 minutes away from this thing, and I'm the guest speaker. And so I was not at my best that evening, but the people were very friendly and receptive and forgiving. And the next morning, we posed for this shot with some important figures in Pawtucket, and I headed out to Dedham, to a particular Dunkin' Donuts, where I was to meet up with my escort into Boston. That's the sheriff there, Thomas Eisenstadt, and we hung around, had a couple of donuts, and then started out the ride to Boston. Now, an interesting thing, you see the officer on the motorcycle there were actually two motorcycles ahead because they'd pair off when they came to an intersection. One would stop to direct traffic and the other would lead me through. And he's riding, there's a big Harley he's on, and he's asking me, how fast I go. And I knew he was in a hurry, as it were. So I gave him my best speed, which over an extended time was 10 miles an hour. And he said he didn't know if he could actually go that slow without stalling. And I told him I didn't know if I could go that fast without collapsing. But we made it, and he led me on into Boston. My brother was taking these pictures. He was riding in one of the cars. He's a photographer. Beautiful street here. I love that. And into the city, there's the Peru, and up Beacon Hill, and to the State House, and where I met with the governor. This is Francis Sargent, governor of Massachusetts. Very impressive man, very good governor. Very friendly. He had fun with this whole thing. We had a good time, him and me. Everyone else is standing around being kind of dull, but he's just cracking up and telling me how to pose. He tells me to point to something on the map for the picture, and this was a cake, believe it or not. That sheet of plywood is actually a cake made by the very famous Montilio's Bakery in Quincy for this event, and that cake, we couldn't get rid of it. I still have one of those bicycles, but other than that, the cake eventually, we tried several different places, and eventually it ended up at a home for orphan children run by the Catholic Church south of Boston, where I'm sure they consumed it for dessert with great joy. I had great trouble not just digging into some of that frosting, but nobody wanted to cut it, and we didn't have enough people to consume it anyway. I mean, we would have taken off New England and Florida and maybe Texas, but there weren't enough people there. There'd been a failure in communication between the governor's office and the Boston Cancer Society because they each thought the other was going to take care of the press coverage, and so neither one of them did it. So the only press actually at this event was the Greenfield Recorder, who had come out on their own and who had been covering this since the first speech I made a year earlier, and had given me very good coverage throughout the whole thing, so it was very nice to see them there. Also attending was Mrs. Mishovic, who was the Greenfield Cancer Society lady that I planned this whole thing with, Luella Mishovic. Mr. Stent was there, and Mr. McCann, and his daughter Kellyanne. I read that Theodore was there too, but I don't remember Theodore. I remember Mrs. McCann was there. My mother was there, a friend of hers was there, my brother was there, but the thing was pretty haphazard, and it basically ended up just being me and the governor joking around for a while, and then he signed my hat, and that was that. We wrapped it up, and I headed home. And there you got my Mount Hermon sweatshirt, worn from beginning to end, and worn for a while after that too, and that's where the rips in the shoulders come from. It wasn't that bad on the end of the trip, but I still have that. So, thank you for listening. Now, I want your money. I think this would be a hoot. It's been 50 years, like I said, 50 years ago today, and it was also a Wednesday, which I find very interesting. And what I'm going to ask you all to do is you can make a copy of this or just write it out and send $5.40 to the Judd Hines Ride for Research, care of your local American Cancer Society office. And I think that would be a hoot. Considering what $5.40 is today compared to what it was back then, we might get more money now than we got back then. There were a lot of people who wrote apology letters that they couldn't pay up when the time came back then. So I've got a list of a bunch of you who still owe on this. So send it on in now, and thanks for listening, and happy day to you.